Hi, hello. Welcome to the first real bonus episode ever of Philosophy. My name is Wellington Tremaine, and this is a podcast primarily about Japanese anime and Western philosophy. The point of the podcast is to talk about these things in a way that both teaches people philosophy and also teaches people how to see it through a literary lens. In this case, we're trying to find philosophy where we can in anime, obviously. However, we're going to be doing something a little different today. As you can see about the episode title, this episode is about the Greek philosopher Empedocles and a very popular Western animated show, Avatar the Last Airbender, often abbreviated as ATLA. So, the topic for today is not exactly anime, but close enough. If you listen to the second episode, which is titled Aristotelian Metaphysics and God into Your Eternity, you will know already sort of why this episode exists, and you have been expecting it. expecting it. Jesus Christ. In that episode, I explained that as I was doing research, I realized that I could teach Empedocles in relation to Atla. And then, since that point, as I was researching for this episode, I realized that I could also teach a little bit of history. And so that's what I'm going to do for this episode. The average watcher of Atla understands/knows that Atla was heavily inspired by the Eastern belief that the world is made up of the four elements and also martial arts, specifically these two things. That's the general consensus of people who watch Atla, given that that's also what the writers have said. We have writings from Buddhism that go back to the Vedic period, which is 1200 to 800 BCE, that mention the five elements. This was later reduced canonically to the four we are familiar with, and which the show focuses on. But my goal in this podcast is to teach primarily Western philosophy because I know it the best, and also because bringing some of that into this decidedly Western animation, which was inspired by Eastern concepts, allows us to address a much more interesting question. But since this is a bonus episode, I feel like I can kind of branch out and not focus so strongly on the philosophy aspect. So I am going to talk about mainly the first crew of Atla and the things that the writers have said, and then kind of explain the history of where this idea of the elements comes from in both Western and Eastern traditions, and how it develops over time. Touch a little on Empedocles, and from there we should be able to explore a much more interesting question, which is what defines Eastern as a concept, and what exactly is Eastern philosophy? In that same vein, what defines Western philosophy, Western religion? What does it mean to use these words, and what can we learn about it from Avatar? Obviously, these are kind of hard questions to answer, and so I'm going to start out as if we're going to answer the questions, and then I'm going to just explore them and touch a little on what I personally think, because it's kind of too lofty of a goal to do that all in just one podcast episode. It's a little much. So, where do we start? Well, we could start by talking about how the ancient world functioned, what we know about trade, and how culture moved from place to place. We could also start by doing comparative philosophy, talking about what philosophy is, its origin, what the difference between Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy is, and then carry that into a discussion about what we actually can see in Atla. Where I want to start, however, is with geography and some history. I want to situate Empedocles first in the ancient world, explain a little bit about him and his hometown, and then we can compare philosophy a little bit, not that much, and move into a discussion of origin, human behavior, what kinds of things we can see in Atla, and then hopefully answer our initial questions a little bit. Again, I'm not trying to do all of this all at once. Though, I'm going to be doing my best. What's tricky, though, is deciding the most important details to convey as I move in and out of history, art history, philosophy, and what was going on in these different areas. But again, I will do my best. Keep in mind that I posted a note and a comment on my Substack of the different maps I used to get a general picture of what the world looked like then and looks like now, so you can see how far away and how close things are to one another. It's also important to visualize where people and groups are, mainly because we as humans have a tendency to make incorrect assumptions about things that we only use words to illustrate. So let's go back to when Empedocles was born. Empedocles was born 494 BC or BCE, depending on which one you want to use, in the Greek city of Acragas, which today would be on the south side of Sicily. So obviously that's in Italy. Greece is separated from Italy by the Ionian Sea, and then Greece is separated from the Persian Empire or Asia Minor, otherwise referred to as Anatolia, by the Aegean. Then there's the island of Crete below Greece on the map, then the Mediterranean Sea. Then below that, Africa and Egypt. the Fertile Crescent, all the good stuff, all the fun ancient civilization crap that we learned in like ninth grade. Very cool. In 540 BCE, the city-states of Ionia, which was not a unified state but rather consisted of various people referred to as the Ionians, were overtaken by the Persians, and that's how we got the Achaemenid Empire, otherwise referred to as the First Persian Empire. In 499 BCE, the Ionian Revolt began, which was inspired by some bullshit this guy Aristagoras, who was a Persian ruling Miletus, decided to get on. He decided he wanted to take over Naxos, which is in the Cyclades, which is a group of Greek islands. This didn't really work, so instead he decided he was going to rile up Ionia into a rebellion against Darius the Great, who was the ruler of the Achaemenid Empire at the time, in order to distract from his obvious bullshit/failure. So there were some battles, and by 494, the Persians had regrouped and kind of knew what they were doing. They stormed Miletus, and the Ionian revolt was squashed. So that was kind of like the big thing happening during this time when Empedocles was born. Granted, he wasn't exactly in the area, but people probably would have been talking about it. Let's just put it that way. Akragas was founded in 581 BCE, and it was a colony of a different colony called Gela, which was to the east. Akragas was a fairly luxurious place to live, according to Empedocles, with at least 6 Doric temples, with one of these being the second largest in the Greek world. The presence of the Doric temples is owed to the fact that both Gela and Akragas inherited Doric institutions and customs. However, there is also evidence that at least Akragas was somewhat unique in its particular adherence to Doric policy and behavior. So it's notable to scholars that Empedocles chose to write in the Ionic language rather than the Doric, following the style of Parmenides using dactylic hexameter. So some scholars argue that Akragas was not purely Doric and neither was Empedocles. The significance of this to me is that it may point to the notion that the culture was more eclectic and may have been more accepting of different practices and ideas. Perhaps a place where outsiders and their beliefs were welcome, but we also don't know that about Akragas. Akragas is today referred to as Agrigento, and on that note, I want to point out here that the Wikipedia for Akragas/Agrigento quotes Plato as stating, "They build like they intend to live forever, yet eat like this is their last day," upon seeing the living standards of the inhabitants. And that statement, attributed to Plato, apparently was taken from a book called The Book of Greek and Roman Folktales, Legends, and Myths, published by Princeton University Press. But a very similar quote is attributed to Empedocles in the book I've primarily quoted from about Empedocles, written by Hel Lambritis. Here's the quote. "The Agrigantines feast as if they were going to die tomorrow and build their houses as if they were going to live forever." So I don't know if that's Plato actually just quoting Empedocles, but it kind of looks like it. I don't have the other book, so I can't double check, but I'm just going to point that out. To be fair, a lot of what we know about the pre-Socratics is hazy and based on other people's accounts written years after their deaths. We do know that Empedocles was likely not aware of some philosophical groups, given their origin in Magna Graecia, though he did travel. It is possible that he had some exposure to Asian philosophy, though what that might have looked like, we don't really know. To quote Lambritis, it seems that he had become a disciple of the Eleatic school quite early, and that he afterwards turned to the study of the more remote doctrines of Heraclitus, of the early Milesians, and perhaps also of some Oriental philosophies. Yet we have no reports of extensive early travels. He made several trips to southern Italy, but apparently did not venture so far afield as Egypt or Babylonia. But just because we don't have evidence of Empedocles traveling particularly far doesn't mean that he wasn't exposed to certain ideas by other people. One thing we do know about Empedocles is that he was also a politician, and before he was expelled from Akragas, he had amassed a great deal of wealth. One reason we know this is because of his activities. For example, Empedocles was reported to have carried out a number of public works at his own expense. To quote Lambritis again, Empedocles diagnosed the cause of a pestilence affecting the neighboring city of Selinus as due to the polluted waters of the river traversing that city. He had the course of 2 other rivers diverted so that they joined with the first, and by the swiftness of their combined currents, the source of the pollution was swept away. This action shows a degree of wealth rare for a single citizen, and the act appears to have been selfless, a gratuitous gesture by a grand seigneur, for no mention can be found that Selinus rewarded him in any way. It did not even grant him citizenship when he was exiled by Akragas. The kind of power afforded by Empedocles here illustrates that he very well may have had information or documentation that others may not have had access to simply because he had the wealth to obtain it. I have not, however, found a single mention of anything owned by Empedocles, such as a library or home, and I don't expect to. We do not even have much of what the pre-Socratics wrote. We do know that Empedocles functioned as a dignitary in Acrogas for about 20 years. So just know that there's a very slim possibility that Empedocles did not come up with the 5 elements on his own. Emphasis on slim just because we have literally no evidence. However, given the way that civilizations rise and fall over time, historically speaking, it's not impossible. If people weren't traveling for trade during that time, they were traveling for military operations. However, again, as I was doing research, I wanted to find out a little bit more about the movements of people and things prior to the famous Silk Road, which, if we're talking about 494 BCE, we still have quite a while until the 2nd century when the Han Dynasty decided to expand into Central Asia. I found a book titled The Prehistory of the Silk Road, which clearly would have been helpful. However, I couldn't get access to it, so instead I found 2 reviews to give me a sense of what was contained within its pages. The book focuses on the Eurasian steppe, which makes sense because the author is a Russian archaeologist. This book explores the Copper and Iron Age throughout the Dnieper and the southern Urals to the south and east, and examines the significance of pastoral nomadism. The fact that she focuses on the Chalcolithic is interesting because there wasn't that much to the Chalcolithic era in Russia specifically. We only have a few artifacts that were copper from that area based off of what I read. But I'm sure it's more interesting to explore a period and geographic area that everyone knows less about than it is to explore a well-known area and time frame. Anyway, the reviewers of her book state that she barely talks about movements of peoples to west to east and vice versa, but they do say something interesting here. Quote, she barely acknowledges movements in the opposite direction, such as the discovery of jade in the Ferghana Valley or silk in southern Uzbekistan, pointing out that she's missing something important here, specifically that there may have been some trade going on between China and other areas. So I looked into this a little, and I found a paper about Hayden jade that was found at Troy, considered to be potentially much older than the Bronze Age. Other than that paper, I pretty much did not find anything else about this. To be fair, it's not really surprising that this particular instance is less exciting for researchers to probably talk about, given that the guy who found the Hayden jade was Heinrich Schliemann, who was incompetent and destroyed a lot of evidence of Troy before they realized, like, oh shit, we found it. He also specifically did not even realize that the jade that they found was important, like at all. So there's that. So personally, I would be a little turned off that stuff too. But the expert who examined the objects found by Schliemann does hypothesize that these implements would have come into the world of ancient Greece through Kashmir, Afghanistan, then Persia. And Persia, we know, was established in 550 BCE, so the 6th century, which is before Empedocles. It's also important to understand that the Persian Empire was created by dominating Aryan empires and then combining them into a unified enterprise, which may not be significant because Aryan immigration into India happened long before the Persian Empire was ever created. But that significance hinges on how early these ideas were circulating in these cultures before they made it into a solidified form in India. But anyway, there's that information. Do with it what you will. So to a certain extent, just by looking at the big picture, it's kind of strange to assume that these various civilizations lost fundamental ideas inherent to their initial cultures. I just don't think that that's a realistic approach, but historians, archaeologists, and a lot of scholars choose to see these places and groups of people in isolation. Primarily, it's academically rigorous to understand these things in isolation based off of the evidence that we actually have. But I just think that scholars also underestimate the ability of people to travel and spread ideas simply because the archaeological record is interpreted by people who have agendas and beliefs that skew their perspectives either intentionally or unintentionally, which isn't, always the case, but you have to understand that sometimes that does happen with everything. Or, we just don't have the evidence and people just don't want to make an assumption, even if it seems intuitive. This is just how things go. And that's why we have peer review and we can fix ideas over time. Unfortunately, I have no peer review here, so I'll be doing the best that I can to get all perspectives on my own, which is a lofty goal, and I expect to fail. Point being, that was really rambly. Empedocles was not the first guy to come up with this shit. So let's talk about the earliest records that we have of this concept. As I mentioned earlier, the earliest source of our information regarding Indian thought is the Veda, which is considered an entire literature. It does not consist of just any one work. This literature is typically regarded as consisting of two parts, the mantras and the Brahmanas, and then there is a third section called the Upanishads, or secret teachings, which are critical to the traditional philosophical foundation of the Vedanta, which in turn is foundational to Hinduism. According to Jeffrey Long, PhD in Religion and Asian Studies, Vedanta is kind of considered a universal philosophy, meaning that a lot of its ideas can be found underneath other philosophical traditions. He also says that the Veda is kind of unknown in origin. We don't know the authors, and we don't know exactly what years the Veda was written in, just a time frame. At the beginning, I said this period was around 1200 to 800 BCE, but according to Hiriana, 1974, the later limit of the Vedic period can be taken as 500 BCE, and the earlier limit, which is what 1200 to 800 refers to, is 1200 to 1500 BCE. And some scholars put that date even earlier at 2000 to 2500 BCE. Obviously, this last part is kind of weird. I have no idea why Hiriana goes forward with BCE, but that's a 300-year difference for the first, so it'd be 1200 to 900 BCE and 2000 to 1500 BCE. Long gives us a different time frame too, which is 1500 to 1000 BCE. Conclusion with a lack of consensus is it's very old. We can agree on that. Long also notes that the word Veda is Sanskrit in origin, which is an Indo-European language. The Vedic texts are all in Sanskrit, and they are all considered Shruti, heard or divinely revealed. Sanskrit has connections to many different cultures because it has connections to many different languages, including some Western languages, so that means theoretically that inadvertently there are going to be commonalities in things like deities and folk tales in different mythologies, because at one point we were all speaking at least derivative languages or dialects that shared an origin either with Sanskrit or perhaps Sanskrit was the origin. This is a pretty common theory amongst a lot of linguists. How possible or true it is, I'm not going to get into it. So, it's very possible, based on how much of the Veda was written over such an extended period of time, that we might not have all of it, especially the early writings. The Veda is traditionally divided into three portions: an action portion, a knowledge portion, and a meditation portion by scholars, which helps us define how Vedic thought has developed over time, and it helps us get a good sense of how this thought system transitioned from an ancient religion to a more philosophical tradition. To reference Hiriana again, the commonly accepted view of the early mantras, hymns or poems, suggests an early form of nature worship and that this was a religion of nature. These early mantras are like chants or prayers addressed to nature, asking for good rain and fertile soil, as if forces like fire, Agni, wind, Vayu, and the sun, Surya, are gods or deities responsible for gifting protection and support to humans through the natural elements they command or even occupy. This is called the action portion of the Veda, and it consists of four portions: the Rig Veda, the Samaveda, the Yajur Veda, and the Atharva Veda. These mantras give us gods like Indra and Varuna, called the two monarchs that support all life, and yet these two gods don't appear in future Indian mythology. Later writings, that of the Brahmanas, illustrate a transition from this religious ritual practice to philosophy. The early omnipotence housed within the god Varuna transforms into a thing possessed by all gods and becomes personified as the highest under the all-doer Visvakarma, which means divine architect, which came out of the Rita, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, cosmic order. In the Brahmanas, we see both monotheism and monism, and the writings we have are geared more towards the priests who were responsible for preserving the Vedic tradition. So the mantras contained poetry and hymns, while the Brahmanas were more like instructions for the priests to follow. So the Brahmanas are a part of the Vedic texts called the Karma Kanda, and they are followed by two groups called the Apsana Kanda, or Aranyakas, and the Jnana Kanda. The Apsana Kanda consists of writings that essentially track the teachings of the priests. So they were things students learned in the forest temples where the Veda was taught, and then those things were written down later. The Jnana Kanda are basically the Upanishads, which is also the knowledge portion of the Veda. Early on, there is a disjunct between the Brahmanas and the Upanishads, but over time this disappears as Hinduism develops. Now, you may be wondering, why is the Veda important to us if it is specifically Hindu? The reason the Veda is important is because the Buddha, the progenitor of Buddhism, would have grown up learning at least some Hindu ideas. And we also know that Buddhism and Hinduism show up in Avatar the Last Airbender. So the fundamental point in discussing the Veda here is to illustrate how it helped shape Buddhism, even though Buddhism is inherently non-Vedic, and even though there are certainly some aspects of Buddhism inherent to the Upanishads. But what do I mean by this? It's generally taken that Hinduism did not presuppose Buddhism in the sense that Buddhism relies on Hinduism in order to exist. It does not. Buddhism has its roots in the Sramana, which is a concept that appears in the Aranyakas for the first time in written history, but it is thought to have been something that developed separately from Hinduism. And this is from Wikipedia. The Sramana refers to a variety of renunciate ascetic traditions from the middle of the first millennium BCE. The Sramanas were individual, experiential, and free-form traditions. The term Sramanas is used sometimes to contrast them with Brahmins in terms of their religious models. However, in the early texts, some predating the 3rd century BCE ruler Ashoka, the Brahmana and Sramana are neither distinct nor opposed. The distinction, according to Olivel, in later Indian literature, may have been a later semantic development possibly influenced by the appropriation of the latter term Sramana by Buddhism and Jainism. Part of the Sramana tradition retained their distinct identity from Hinduism by rejecting the epistemic authority of the Vedas, while a part of the Sramana tradition became part of Hinduism as one stage in the ashrama dharma, that is, as renunciate sannyasins. So the latter version of Sramana, the Hindu version, is not what we're talking about. Sramana is a Sanskrit word that refers to a person who labors, toils, or exerts themselves as a mendicant for some higher purpose. The word means one who strives in a literal sense. These people were often nomadic and had renounced typical society in order to follow a spiritual or religious path, and their principles are said to be the root of Jainism and Buddhism, which are the two other main religions in India. As I stated before, Buddhism is said to have been developed, practiced, and promoted by the proverbial Buddha. Emphasis on is said to have been. It is generally debated as to whether Buddhism existed in a fundamental sense before the arrival of the Buddha, though it is generally agreed that Sramana, being the root of Buddhism, existed pre-6th century BCE. So, Indian systems are ultimately derived from the invention of the Veda, though they do not directly follow from the Vedic period. And this is when we have evidence of Vedic thought influencing places like Greece, according to Hirayana in 1974, though Hirayana does not go into that statement at all. I do not know what they mean by that. They literally just said, like, influencing Greece, period. But to me, anyway, that is promising, though I would love if they expounded upon that point. Now let's talk about Buddhism and why it's important for the production of Atla. Buddhism is said to have started in the 6th or 5th century BCE and declined in India during the 8th century BCE. During that time, it had been disseminated to East Asia and Southeast Asia. So East Asia is obviously places like China, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Mongolia. Not sure about North Korea, but I assume so. Southeast Asia would be Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand. Then there's another layer to this, which is basically the existence or creation of the Sinosphere, which is the title given to the Chinese cultural sphere that was developed throughout history from Imperial China's interactions specifically with Japan, Vietnam, and Korea. And the Sinosphere is actually how Japan got kanji, Korea got hanja, and Vietnam got chuhan. As the Chinese influence dissipated, these countries developed their own additional unique writing systems. So this would also be the way that these places, when they inherited Chinese scripture in this way, inherited Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. Obviously not the only way, but that is one way. China also did not have sole influence over these locations, though they gave them something indispensable. As McRae 1995 writes, just as Buddhism was never hermetically isolated as an independent unit, but remained a fluid system of processes in discourse with its cultural environment, so was China a construct that constantly redefined itself through interaction with its cultural others. So this would be true for Japan, Korea, and Vietnam as well. The Han Dynasty, which was from 206 BCE to 220 CE, is seen as the moment where we start to get translations of Buddhist materials into the Chinese Buddhist canon, otherwise referred to as the Great Storage of Scriptures, and this carries on into subsequent generations and obviously is disseminated into these other locations. The impact of Buddhism on China has prevailed ever since, but the real question is, how did Buddhism get into China in the first place? This brings us back to the Silk Road, which was in fact opened during the Han Dynasty. Archaeological evidence suggests that Buddhism arrived in China as early as late 2nd century BCE through both land and sea. So Buddhism was partially coming into China through the Tarim Basin, which we mentioned before in relation to the nephrite found by Heinrich Schliemann's crew. So, if jade nephrite was found dated from even before the Silk Road, there is a possibility that if items could be distributed even from China to Greece, that ideas could in fact somehow make it to Greece as well from India, even if we don't have very much evidence of that from the Chalcolithic Age and the Bronze Age. Given that Persia/Iran is kind of like right there, I just don't think it's an insane idea when we know that the first Persian Empire stretched all the way to India's Indus Valley and also included the Nile Valley. And we know that Zoroastrianism was huge in the Achaemenid Empire, and it's still a thing in Iran and India today. And that was being taught by Zoroaster in 1500 to 500 BCE. In this scenario, Vedic thought made it over to Greece rather than Buddhist thought, but like I said, it's not inconceivable. The point is that there's access, and with access, there's possibility. I think this is why when I'm reading, people want to mention the possibility that Empedocles was influenced by Oriental philosophy, but everyone seems tentative to get into it. Though Jeffrey Long does actually talk about it near the end of his video, which made me happy because he made a couple of good points, and you should look at that if you get the chance. Most importantly, he mentions that we know for sure that Greece and India were interacting through trade during the Hellenistic era after Alex the Great invaded the northwestern part of India around 327. All of this being said, I watched a video the other night by a YouTuber called Milo Rossi. I think he goes by Mini Minuteman. Wikipedia says he's an archaeologist, I think, but he makes videos about ancient ruins and various conspiracies surrounding ancient sites. And I was watching one the other night about the Giza pyramid conspiracy. And I had a flashback to the one archaeology class that I took at Victoria because I wanted I wanted more experience, So I was like, I'll take a classics class. And this class was called the Bronze Age Aegean. So we were actually studying Greece in the Bronze Age. And we had to write this assignment discussing a particular site. This is gonna sound so bad. I me being me, because I'm so ambitious inside my head in terms of like, I want to know everything. And I was too overzealous. We talked briefly about this is gonna sound bad. Sorry, I sound so fucking stupid. We talked briefly about like these various sites that like people thought were Atlantis at some point, and so like I got in my head because we had to do like this is just a basic archaeology assignment. It was a write up basically like about the site, different like data that they collected from these sites, and since they were underwater, these sites that were supposedly Atlantis, and so I was like, would it not be cool to do an underwater site for this assignment? Unfortunately, because it's underwater, there's not much data that they actually got from these things. So since it was a write-up, and I was so focused on like, I want to do one about Atlantis, like basically, I chose the site Pavlopetri. And I started like researching like all about different articles like about Atlantis. And then like it was so close to the assignment to being due, and I realized I had like basically nothing about Pavlopetri because there was hardly any data on the actual site. It was all just like bullshit that I like put down. It was like lettuce do like, and I'm like, I'm gonna get such a bad grade. I think I ended up getting a B- because I had to like change everything last minute because like again, there was just not that much data, and like, but I spent like half of it like trying to compare. Like, I don't even know what was going through my head. I like had a mind blank. I'm like, conspiracy moment. I gotta go. I gotta go. I gotta leave. I gotta go into this other realm. Anyway, I'm like, am I doing this here? I really hope I'm not doing this here. And that's something I don't want to do with history ever again, because like, really, I just got caught up in like, the same way that like people in America get caught up in like these cults. It's just so like gratifying to be like, ooh, it's mysterious, da da da. And then you realize that you sound like an idiot. You're like, oh my god, what am I doing? So anyway, with this, I don't want to. I really want to emphasize that a lot of this stuff is just me like throwing out ideas based off of what I've read, and I don't want anyone to take like 100% anything that I say as fact, because like here I'm not technically supporting a conspiracy because I'm trying to be honest about how I have no idea if this stuff like made it over to Greece, but I do want to support the possibility simply because doing so will help me later on when I'm talking about like the weaknesses and problems inherent to perceiving the world in terms of an East and West divide. And I want to emphasize how people make these distinctions in the literature because the ways that they do illustrates the way that politics ultimately pans out. And this is ultimately what we're teaching our children. Anyway, let's not do Pavla Petri again. Good times. Anyway, let's get into Empedocles real fast and explain the four elements thing, because obviously I don't want to leave that out, even though this is more about the other questions that I've been talking about. Like I said, Empedocles was a Greek philosopher, and he was also kind of crazy, like me. He died by jumping into a volcano so that he could prove that he was an immortal. Obviously, he did not prove anything with that, but his other philosophy about the nature of the world was heavily influential even after his death. He believed that the world was made up of fire, water, earth, and air/ether. This concept was carried down into medieval medicine and religion, leading to their connection with the humors of the body. And I believe that actually that was going on in Greece before that, but I do not quite remember. I did not look that up. I will go check that. The four elements are purportedly sourced specifically from Empedocles, given that Aristotle credits him as being the first to come up with it. However, it's pretty hazy even in Greek history whether or not Empedocles was the first to discover the idea. This is from Lambertus again. Aristotle, basing himself on the traditions of the Milesians and of Heraclitus and disregarding the infinite of Anaximander, maintains that it was Empedocles who added to the three already known elements, water, air, and fire, the most palpable of all, earth. Simplicus concurs, relying on Theophrastus's physical opinions. However, as already noted, Xenophanes, the near centenarian from Colophon, seems to have been the first to put forward a theory of the four elements. Although, according to Diogenes Laertius, the theory actually stems from further back in time. He states that it was held by Manethos as well as by the historian Hecataeus, adding that they had both acquired it from Egypt and that they believed the four elements were originally merged in one primeval stuff, matter, and were later separated from it. Empedocles does something interesting when discussing the elements. Obviously, he's writing in a poetic fashion following from Parmenides, and in doing so, he mixes up the elements with the gods. For example, of the roots of all things, hear me first speak. Zeus the white splendor, Hera carrying life, and Adonis and Nestis whose tears bedew mortality. This passage has caused a lot of controversy over which god refers to which element. Does Hera refer to the earth? Does Zeus refer to the sun? Aristotle called Empedocles Homeric because he uses poetic devices such as metaphor commonly in his work. It should be understood, though, that Empedocles, throughout his philosophical career, is specifically responding to his contemporaries, such as Thales and Thales' successor Anaximander, as well as Anaximenes, Parmenides, Pythagoras, and Heraclitus, and the linguistic composition of his work shows this. Empedocles thought that the only immortal and indestructible things in reality were the four elements. He noticed that the world changes regularly, but that things appeared to happen in cycles. So there must be something constant in order for things to return the same. Quote, they are forever themselves, but running through each other, they become at times different, yet are forever and ever the same. Consequently, the four elements will mix together in various proportions, and depending on whatever composition results from measure, a thing or creature will result. When the creature or thing perishes or decays, only the elements remain. Which is kind of true. He was getting there. Either these elements return to their original mass of elements, a return which has the capacity to be a chaotic time for the world, so he thinks that there is a whole group of elements like elsewhere, called the spheros, or they regroup into new things. Quote, from these grow all things that ever were and are and will be, trees and men and women, and birds and beasts, and the fish nourished in salty water, as well as the long-lived gods honored above all. For they are always themselves, but running through each other, they take on various forms and shapes. So much does the mixture change them. Personally, I think the translated phrase running through each other is really interesting and may have something to do with Thales's theory that everything is made out of water. This phrase carries the implication of bodies of running water, such as streams or rivers, pushing into one another or otherwise being combined in some way. I say this because Empedocles also believes that the elements are controlled by two exterior forces. The two underlying forces that Empedocles thinks controls or dictates the world are love and strife otherwise known as hatred. These are what push and pull these otherwise inert elements into their various forms. And actually, this is an idea that we can see in the Avatar universe as well. Love as a life force, love as a force that creates harmony, brings things together. We'll talk a little bit about it later, but the very creation of the Avatar figure emerged because a god named Rava fell in love with a mortal. They merged into one being, and then the Avatar was the result. The Avatar consequently plays an integral role in the world as a peacemaker between the realm of spirits and the realm of humans. So now that I've talked about Empedocles a little bit, let's get into Atla, because I think you'll realize pretty quickly why I wanted to talk about the East and West divide at all. Not only is it a really interesting question, it's also a really important one that gets highlighted almost immediately when you look at Atla. And I'm intentionally leaving Korra mostly out of this, not because it wasn't as good of a series or something. I just know it less well. It's also not exactly necessary to like explaining the things that I'm going to talk about. And it becomes just an extra thing to talk about that we probably don't have time for. Atla is more important because it is where we get most of our world building, so it sets us up with the elements that we need to understand the Avatar world. The first episode ever of Atla starts with a brother and sister named Sokka and Katara, and they're out in the freezing cold waters of the South Pole fishing. Immediately, we get some pretty good writing because Sokka is trying to fish like a person who has no special powers, and Katara catches a fish by manipulating water as if by magic. An organic fight breaks out between the two because Sokka hates that she's messing around with water powers and also has some misogynistic and anti-bending opinions about it. Katara immediately gets angry at this, and their fight causes her to break open a glacier by accident, which reveals a young boy encased in a massive orb of ice. Katara insists on breaking him out, and a huge beam of power explodes from the ice as the boy breaks free. He is reluctant to tell these new people who he is, but this boy is the Avatar, and his name is Aang. So you can see that this story kind of throws everything at you and explains things as it goes, though it does have a different opening for the first episode, which explains the importance of the four elements and how this world has been subjugated under the rule of fire, and also how the Avatar is missing. The Avatar is revealed to be the most powerful figure in this world. He or she has the ability to command water, fire, earth, and air, and also has been missing for 100 years, hidden deep in a glacier, asleep. The Avatar's role is to be a peacemaker for the four different nations, which are defined by whichever element their people are able to manipulate. In his absence, the world has fallen at the feet of the Fire Nation, and the Avatar must learn the other three elements he does not yet know before the Fire Lord solidifies his power as ruler of the world. Although Avatar pulls inspiration from pretty much everywhere in Asia, we see pretty much from the very beginning that the most aesthetic inspiration hails from China. Every type of elemental bending has a corresponding martial art that inspired the movements of the characters as they manipulate the world around them. Fire bending was inspired by Northern Shaolin Kung Fu, water bending by Tai Chi, earth bending Hung Ga, and airbending was inspired by Bagua, also known as circle walking. The martial arts consultant for the show, Sifu Kisu, had enough impact on the production of the show to the point where he was represented in the story as Master Piandao, Sokka's sword master in season 3, so perhaps that illustrates how important he was to the production. The nation states of the Atla universe were ultimately developed in relation to whatever martial art was connected to their culture. In this way, the show is largely Chinese, but we see also moments where Japanese and Indian influences shine through. For example, the character Momo, a flying lemur, is named by Aang after the Japanese word for peach. And a real reasoning is built into the story so that it seems organic and not just placed there arbitrarily. The creation of the concept of the avatar was also ultimately Indian, simply because the avatar is a character based on the Buddha. And we know he's based on the Buddha because not only is the avatar meant to be a peacemaker, but the avatar is a historical figure that reincarnates into new bodies until the cycle is finally broken. The myth of the Buddha is the following: a baby is born from a traveling mother who dies shortly after giving birth. The baby is taken in by his father, who is a king, and the child is prophesied to either become a great world leader or a great spiritual leader. The king, wanting to ensure that his son becomes a great world leader, decides to shield the child from illness and suffering and everything that's wrong with the world. The baby grows into a young man, living a life of luxury and shielded from worldly strife. With the help of the gods, he eventually leaves the palace walls and comes across 4 different scenes, each of which tell him something about the world. First, he sees an old beggar, then a sick man, then a corpse, and then finally a traveling ascetic. The fourth scene is supposed to give the man hope. From that moment forward, he decides to become a mendicant and leaves his wife and child and the palace behind, becoming the Buddha with whom we are well acquainted. It is thought that the Buddha is reincarnated until he finally reaches a state where the cycle must be broken. In terms of which Buddhism is represented here, we can surmise that Chinese Buddhism is more likely because the air nomads are designed in reference to Shaolin monks, and also most bending is based on Chinese martial arts. Now, we don't know who Aang's parents are. We don't know if he really has them, but we do know that he is partially sheltered from the rest of the world as an air nomad in the air temples, which are separated from the rest of the nations completely. I did also think, though this story may not have been a reference at all for the creators, given that we don't really get from them what their specific influence was here, but the 4 different scenes is synonymous with 4 different elements. So it's possible that that could have been something that influenced that, but I also want to make sure that you don't think that I got that from somewhere. I'm just coming up with that right now. Um, but yeah, that's maybe. When it comes to the creator's choice to integrate the chakra system into Atla, however, we find that they specifically choose to reference Hinduism. In Buddhism, the chakra system typically has 4 to 5 chakras. In Atla, a total of 7 chakras are referenced, which is in keeping with the Hindu tradition. So you can see how they're being syncretic with their story writing. Additional Chinese influence is illustrated in the representation of Taoism in Atla. When Aang, Katara, and Sokka arrive at the Northern Water Tribe, a subplot emerges about the gods that govern the Atla world. Carefully hidden within the frozen city is a tiny oasis of green grass, a temple, and a pond housing 2 ancient koi fish, one white and one black. This is a representation of yin and yang, but in this scenario, the fish are the earthly incarnate depictions of the moon god. There's a joke here in the gods becoming fish too, more than just the fact that the moon commands the tides. In Taoism, there is a belief in a cosmic force that is always balancing itself out, much like Empedocles' love and strife, but this is what the yin and yang refers to. Water is about harmony, and it helps that the Tao Te Ching, which is basically the Taoist Bible, is a book of poetry that emphasizes living at peace with others and the world. So it naturally contains a rhythm, kind of illustrating the point that the text itself is making in an inherent sense. To quote Orlovsky Scherer, 2020, the Fire Nation made a grave mistake when they destroyed the yin koi fish and the yin spirit. Yin and yang only exist in relation as a mutual whole. Without one, the other cannot exist. Aang is not just fighting a war against the Fire Nation, he is fighting to restore a spiritual balance in the world. Of course, this balance is then restored later by the Northern Water Tribe's princess, who becomes the moon in place of the god that was killed, which we're not going to get into, but that was a fun episode. But anyway, the problem is solved and everything's sort of okay. Now I would like to take a moment to talk about the form in which symbolism appears in Avatar. As you can see with the koi fish, the bending, and the Buddha, small bits of inspiration from various cultures are applied, and the inspiration is obvious, like they're almost superficial. Usually, cultures are represented in Atla in a way that is rather broad. So, in the case of bending, great care was taken to execute traditional movements, breathing, emotion, etc. But outside of these large ideas, there's actually not that much. I think we want to ascribe more inspiration from other cultures than is actually there, and quite frankly, this is a common problem in Western media. In a chapter I found called Mindfulness and Madness in Martial Arts Philosophy, the author points out that many of the religious or philosophical connections we make to martial arts are incorrect. Even better, I could now see an immediate or obvious potential connection between rest, Eastern philosophy, and martial arts. For, as is commonly believed, there has long been a connection made between East Asian martial arts and supposedly Taoist or Zen Buddhist ideas of calmness and tranquility. Of course, much of this connection is based on myths, and mainly media myths at that. And that's the end of the quote. There is perhaps a problem with Western audiences' interpretations of the Avatar story, then, in this way. Perhaps we attribute more than is actually there, perhaps because the creators are hailed as doing an excellent job. And that's not to say that they didn't do an excellent job, it's just that we might attribute way more than is actually present in the show. Intentionally, I mean. Take Momo, for example. One of the reasons I wanted to mention that his name means peach in Japanese is because the writers seem to occasionally layer cultures on top of one another, or at least that's what the Avatar Wiki wants us to think. In the episode where we meet Momo, Aang names the lemur after the moon peach Momo gifts Sokka. Additionally, the Avatar Wiki explains, the name is also the shortened form of the Japanese dwarf flying squirrel Momonga. In Tales of Ba Sing Se, Momo was written as, insert Chinese characters, which means touch, imitate in Chinese. It can also be seen as the phase in Chinese where a name is repeated twice to show affection, cuteness, or is used to address someone younger, like a nickname as in Tom Tom. That's the end of the quote. So you can see how they're not really choosing to represent any one culture with this kind of representation, though it's heavily suggested that the reference is Japanese. The creators basically didn't elaborate on what the choice was beyond Aang's motivation to name the lemur Momo. And so the fans who write Avatar Wiki just came up with a bunch of things that they found and put it down on paper or on the internet and said, these are interpretations of the choice that they made here. But they also didn't elaborate. They were placed as trivia. Okay, so it's basically suggesting that these are actual motivations as to developing the character rather than just taking what the creators said and putting that down. So, in that same vein, Momo's character was originally completely different in the early stages of production planning. He was not a flying lemur, but a robot. No, I'm not kidding. And this is also from the Avatar Wiki. Momo was intended to be a Cyclops robot monkey that survived the destruction of a lost civilization over 1,000 years prior. Originally, he possessed Aang's trademarked staff and arrows. His name was also different, being planned to be Momo 3. So, purportedly, his name was always going to be Momo, and so it was always going to perhaps be signified as meaning peach. But again, they haven't exactly told us what the motivation is here. So, it's perhaps a bad choice to put all this extra stuff down when we're not even sure if that was any of the reasoning behind his character. So again, my point in talking about Momo here is to emphasize that maybe we attribute more symbolism or inspiration from these various cultures to Atla than is actually there, and it leads to false statements by fans about what the meaning behind certain choices were. For example, there has been a long-standing rumor that there is a Japanese myth where a person will inherit the face of the person that they loved in a previous life, and that is why every time the avatar reincarnates, he or she resembles the previous avatar's lifelong partner. The problem is that this myth doesn't exist in Japanese culture at all. Somebody just made it up and then started spreading it around. And then, since the part about the avatar's visage is true, people just took it as fact. And that's problematic because it creates this overblown sense that Avatar is deeper in terms of referentiality than it actually is. The most important inspiration is pretty much most of what we've covered. Like, there are obviously other small things, like Momo's name. There's a lot of linguistic representation in particular, but we don't have a lot of definitive arguments for the reason that those choices were made. And that's my point. Not that those things might not be there, but that we don't actually know because they haven't elaborated on that. Another example is another trivia fact from the Avatar wiki, which states the following. The name Zuko is phonetically similar to Suko, a Cebuano word meaning angry. This derivation corresponds to Zuko's ill-tempered personality portrayed in all three books. End quote. Cebuano is an Austronesian language from the southern Philippines, and the question, of course, is whether or not this was an intentional choice. Other people on the internet, none of whom appear to be the creators, have given additional linguistic reasons as to why he was named that. The citation for this particular note, however, in the wiki is quite simply not sufficient. Whoever wrote this simply referred to Wiktionary rather than quoting the directors on it, so it could literally mean nothing. Why would you put this in here? And here's another example, slightly different this time. In episode 7 of the Water Book, we first meet Heibai in his monster form. Heibai, which is Chinese for black and white, is a forest spirit who has become enraged upon the decimation of his forest home and is disappearing nearby villagers, believing them to be responsible for the burning of his home. His normal form is that of a panda bear. Though I have found no mention of this anywhere, anyone who is familiar with Japanese folklore might immediately think that Heibai is meant to mimic a Japanese kodama. To quote Matsura, a kodama is a mysterious tree spirit or kami, which means god, that's also considered a yokai. It has several different manifestations, or oftentimes no manifestation at all. They are mentioned in both the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, where it was called a tree god or spirit of the wood. Kodama can surface as invisible presences, mysterious noises such as sudden high screeching, groaning sounds, or unexplainable echoes, or more rarely, various physical forms. Sometimes a kodama will manifest as a ball of light, an animal, or even a human. The kodama are said to protect the trees specifically. When you watch out for the trees watch out for you. Heibai does not fully embody these traits, but he can shift form and is clearly inspired by the destruction of his forest to act. He is one of the stronger indications of the story having direct inspiration from a specific culture, and yet the creators don't talk about it, and neither does the wiki. The special trivia fact about his character is that his monster form was apparently inspired by the angels from the mecha anime Neon Genesis Evangelion. And to me, this kind of tells me that the creators were really more focused on writing a good story rather than making explicit references to things, though obviously that happens because they really skip over what they've done here for some reason. If you watch a lot of anime, the forest spirit thing is like old hat. You see it all the time. The book I quoted earlier mentions Princess Mononoke, for example, and how the forest spirits manifest in that movie. And I can imagine the creators honestly just thinking oh, right, we need a forest spirit episode, and then not really thinking to mention it to anybody. So it's more interesting to mention the mecha anime inspiration than it is to point out that they're following a common anime trope. It is just cause for me to wonder whether the creators knew to clarify these things to their audiences. Was it strategic or not? Did it not cross their minds? I find it hard to believe that they didn't know, given the press that's dedicated to praising Atla. The point I'm making here is to simply be aware of the fact that a lot of the stuff you read about different media that isn't written by sites like Polygon or Screen Rant, where whatever nerd site that has not written an article based off of actual discussions with the creators, could be at least partially false. So if you want to focus on things that were actually said, and so when I said Heibai is a Kodama, I do believe that, but you have to understand that that's just my interpretation. And the reason that this is important is because this is the same thing I'm doing with regards to Empedocles. It's basically me connecting the dots and being well, maybe, but I don't have direct evidence of that. And that's important when you're writing anything. The moral here is that if you are in college or whatever, just in general, do not take things that are written at face value unless you can confirm it through a primary source. And if you can't confirm it, but it's interesting to you and you want to take a stance, you have to be honest and be yeah, I may be wrong, but here's why I think this. And then back up your perspectives the best you can. You will produce better work because you will be self-aware, and that is always the most important thing. So on to the next thing I wanted to talk about. We notice that there's something specific happening here with Atla in terms of westernized myth making of Eastern concepts, and so it's time to talk about a different but ancillary type of myth making. The highly unclear terms East and West. What do they mean? People often refer to the West or East as if they are defined things that we can definitively pinpoint, either as a group of countries or a set of values, often centered in a particular geographic location spanning some just long enough period of time. In the media, you often hear these terms in discussions of politics or history in reference to places such as the UK or China or the US. In terms of the West, typically what is meant by the term is that a particular country has some sort of educational institutional heritage connected to Greece specifically. But it gets weird almost immediately because, well, let's take the United States. The United States draws from both Greece and the Roman Empire in terms of institutional prowess. However, the Roman Empire, around the time that Constantine established Constantinople, began to be associated with the East specifically because of this development. Sorry, that sounds like a circular argument, but I think you understand what I mean. To quote Austerhout, 2004, the idea of the Eastern Trojan ancestry of the Romans must have been in the mind of Constantine as well, as he founded a new capital, Constantinople, in the East, and the public monuments he imported to decorate his new city may reflect this. And so, drawing from this original type of separation that happened at that time, much later we start to see certain depictions of the Orient. The East was associated with the feminine and the opulent, with all sorts of gold, striking blues, and this is why when we look at the development of what was called Orientalism later on in the 19th century, where we got painters showing that they could paint silk and cashmere and slightly darker skin and romanticizing what they considered the East. Part of this was due to Edward Said's Orientalism, which was published in 1978, but the division between Greece and Rome in 324 was really where this idea of separating the world into two halves really fomented because it shaped how people thought about two incredibly influential opposing forces. Greece was seen as rational, democratic, and civilized, while the East was portrayed as irrational and uncivilized and brash. In our time, however, that viewpoint has expanded beyond these two powers to represent much greater swaths of land and groups of people. And of course, while the titles do not change, perspectives do. To the East, we are uncivilized and irrational, and to us, the East plays that role. We reduce each other to base appearances. We attribute to the East primarily the positive aspects of their religion and philosophy, and they ignore our philosophy in order to focus on our brash natures, the history of the Wild West, our inability to visit anything other than a McDonald's while abroad. So you can see how these behaviors both reflect and impact politics on many sides. But with these perspectives comes great responsibility, for it matters who each side chooses to be part of their group. And then there's the added problem of values in geography, climate, and culture. New Zealand is considered Western despite not really being either. It's more Polynesian simply because it's part of the Commonwealth, for example. Guam belongs to the United States, and so it sometimes falls under the umbrella of Western simply because of that fact. At the same time, in regular discussion, no one would seriously say that Guam has any cultural similarities to the US beyond its responsibilities, and no one would say that Guam should be considered Western. But because of its political positioning, it slides in and out of the picture. Birkin, 1992, explains that Western civilization has taken many forms to different scholars. Some have conceived the Western world as centered around the Mediterranean and beginning with the Greeks. Some believe that the Western world is just that which developed after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Birkin personally rejects the inclusion of Greece and Rome as part of the West because it, quote, claims to know them too well without recognizing the full extent of their radical otherness, and suggests a narrow approach to Western civilization by embracing Germany and its influence on the development of the modern world, or its impact on the Enlightenment. He also rejects the inclusion of Byzantium and Islam into our definitions of the West, given that the West we identify today only knows them well because we teach them as canon to the development of our civilization. And they may be, right? The influence of Islam in the building of Hagia Sophia, a decidedly Christian church, cannot be understated. So then there's the question of whether or not a division of East and West really serves anyone other than politicians particularly well anymore. The resultant broad scope of allowing so many civilizations to rest underneath the umbrella of the West is ultimately a geopolitical problem. And I'm going to read from Birkin's What is Western Civilization article, page 457. Still another benefit of jettisoning the expanded definition and thus excluding Greco-Roman, Islamic, and Byzantine civilization from our definition of the West is that it restores the specificity of the latter civilizations. In a real sense, the expanded definition of Western civilization created an unwarranted feeling of familiarity with Byzantium, Islam, and especially the classical world. To include Greece and Rome in the West was to claim to know them too well without recognizing the full extent of their radical otherness, as I said. As a participant in Western civilization, a restricted definition of that civilization tells me that classical Greece and Rome are not us, but a part of our cultural ancestry. This in turn makes it possible to begin to construct a genealogy of civilizations in which the West is a half-sibling of Islam and Byzantium, the other descendants of Christian Roman culture. But whereas the West also had a Germanic ancestry, the Islamic world possessed an Arab descent. The ancestral metaphor can be taken further. The limited definition of the West rejects the idea that Western notions of freedom arose in Greece and Rome, instead tracing such notions to the contractual nature of feudal society. Advocates of this limited definition might point out that in constructing the modern state out of the remnants of feudalism, Western thinkers ransacked the classical world for justifications for all sorts of political schemes. The Greco-Roman world contributed not only ideas about republican freedom, but also notions of imperial despotism. In this sense, Western political theorists went through the ideas of the classical civilization with the kind of half unfamiliarity of children rummaging through the clothes of the grandparents in an old attic. He's advocating for a narrow definition of Westernism because he believes that it was medieval culture that came up with these ideas and took them from Greece and Rome, and it has actually nothing to do with us anymore. So the point here is that an unhelpfully broad definition of Westernism or Easternism is simultaneously rather predatory and childish, but also an impossible task. To quote Baum, 1977, the more intricately one studies the details of life of particular persons or of particular times, the more likely perhaps is he to despair of ever finding bases for broad generalizations about persisting cultural traits. We need to remember that any definition, broad or otherwise, will never do absolute justice to the ultimate concerns of differing philosophies on both sides of the perceived spectrum, because even the philosophy of dead men and women grow and change as we grow and change. Our histories evolve just as we evolve, and even so, our goal is to identify clear static elements of fact in these traditions. Let me levy two quick observations from me. 1. All civilizations seem to seek at least some kind of truth of their own histories, regardless of whether that truth is some kind of linear, event-based truth. And 2, people from English-speaking countries have a vested interest in making other cultures synonymous with their own. The first point I'm not going to address, I'm simply going to say it as something for you to think about. And the second I want to illustrate briefly as an idea, not something that you should necessarily take to heart as fact, but more, again, something to think about, but it's something that I need to explain. I think that the problem partially has to do with language. English is typically synonymous with the concept of Western civilization. We include Commonwealth countries in our ultimate definition of the West, as well as the European countries we inherited much of our language from. English is a Germanic language, one of the Romance languages, and it is considered a mutt language. It developed in medieval England and contains elements of Latin, French, German, ancient Greek, Arabic, and Dutch, and was influenced by a number of additional older cultures and dialects. It became a lingua franca primarily through colonization, and paired with trade, war, internal developments, etc. This led to a perception that the West is open, it's big, it's all encompassing. One thing that we know is that language informs culture, but that also culture informs language. There is a back and forth that leads to linguistic and cultural evolution. In terms of English, it's very easy to incorporate new words from other languages into its world in a structural sense. That's not to say that other languages can't do that, because it can, but English is very, very good at it. Grammar rules consistently change, there are always exceptions, and so there's a lot of versatility with what you can do with English, or by putting new words into an English sentential context. For example, it was easy for me in college to learn certain vocabulary words from Arabic from my roommate and her friends, such as haram, although I didn't take any Arabic. It's easy to say that's haram, for example, incorporating this new word into my lexicon, even though it's not from my culture. There are other languages where you can do this just fine, of course, but I think it makes a difference when your language is literally everywhere in almost every country all the time. It creates a sense that you belong everywhere because your history and language is very, very big and seems momentarily to always have been. Part of this, too, is the mere existence of the United States, the culture of which has this same history of colonization, paired with a language that has the capacity to steal quickly and easily because of its eclectic origins. Obviously, this may be too broad of a generalization, but I think it helps to contextualize, at the very least, the West in this way in terms of something like Atla. Atla was created by Brian Conizzo and Michael Dante DiMartino for Nickelodeon. However, you may not know, because I didn't, that a lot of the production for the show took place in South Korea. The studios responsible were JM Animation, Moy Animation Co. Limited, DR Movie Co. Limited. They also worked on Legend of Korra, I believe, before they handed it over to Studio Mir. And I find this really interesting because this is clearly an American production in the sense that it's written in English by Americans, largely for Americans, but then the inspiration for the work seems to come primarily from China and Japan. China because of their culture, and then Japan because of how beloved anime is in the West, and then it was produced mostly in South Korea. Like, apart from it being incredibly beloved, it truly is a multinational effort to bring all kinds of ideas together. So, is it really surprising then that Atla pulls so easily and quickly from these different places in order to develop something totally new and very quote unquote Western? I think Atla expresses the way that Americans, in particular, being a world power, really think about these different cultures. Forcing Polynesian countries under the umbrella of either West or East is ultimately problematic, for example, but we want to smash these things together, which created something wonderful. Not necessarily racist or any sort of specific disrespect, but which is ultimately unfair to those civilizations because that's kind of how we think about everything. So, is this not something we've been doing for decades already? When I was reading the paper on banal nationalism written by CARE 2023, I started thinking about how so many of us in every country have this innate need or desire to organize people into nations as if it's a natural instinct. The article specifically addresses nationalism in Atla in order to say that Avatar both criticizes this tendency and reinforces this tendency. Every civilization in Atla is made to be distinct and homogeneous in terms of identity, but at the same time shows a group of people formed out of all the nations working to fight against the one nation that's trying to control everything. And in this way, the show illustrates the benefit of coming together as a greater whole, a hodgepodge of various powers and ideas working towards a common goal or good. And I think that's why people like it so much. It ignores cultural boundaries in order to support the notion of fighting for what's right, rather than fighting for tradition. So when we talk about the West, we do have an innate understanding that Greece and Rome are accidentally part of our history, as is Europe. European civilization is rather disparate and extends beyond the border of Europe, and so when we're talking about the history of Europe in addition to the history of the Roman Empire, they kind of become the same animal because they're messy. And the United States is messy. When I was watching the Literature Devil video recorded in the bibliography, I thought about this because of the topic matter. They were discussing the difference between Western and Eastern storytelling, and they used Chinese cinema and Japanese anime to compare to the Netflix live action remake of Death Note, The Odyssey, and Oedipus Rex. Now, I don't really agree with the choice to talk about the remake, seeing as almost every Death Note fan, even in America, basically hated it. But I understood the point in talking about Oedipus Rex in the Odyssey because we recreate these stories all the time into new content, just like how Clueless is meant to be a remake of Jane Austen's Emma. These stories, regardless of whether they really belong to us, remain in our canon and have become a part of us by sheer admiration, if nothing else tangible. And so maybe Western history really is just a mutt of different things. But maybe even Eastern history is too, if in a different way, simply because if you go far back enough, there was at least some information being shared between neighboring nations and states. The idea that Asian countries are totally insular is wrong. So the point that I want to make, even if you don't like that last point that I made, maybe a lot of this has to do with just how we want to view each other and how we want to view ourselves. Maybe it's not nearly as complicated as we want to make it out to be. Maybe we just want to align ourselves according to what we were taught, and it's not just about history or politics. I think we participate in prolonging these myths because we can't totally unlearn the things that we were taught. And that's okay, but we should acknowledge it. So, in conclusion, the point of this episode was to show how thin these lines are that we draw. I don't have an answer as to whether or not we should keep the West and East divide, but personally, I would get rid of it. It's not like I know what's best for the world. This episode was also about how Atla is both good and bad because it accurately portrays a lot of different cultures, but it also inaccurately tells us certain things or allows people to make assumptions about different cultures that don't necessarily appear in the story. We don't even really know, for example, what version of Buddhism is inspiring Atla because Buddhism is so widespread. It's most likely to be Chinese, but again, the authors don't say it. And maybe the goal shouldn't be to define each piece of the story in terms of other cultures, each nation that appears within it. Maybe Atla is simply a mutt, and that's good enough.